Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by scholars who have done research in the historical collections held in the Hagley Library, especially folks who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joins me today. Maxwell Greenberg is a PhD student in history and education policy at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Maxwell, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Excited to talk about some of the interesting collections at Hagley and a little bit about the work that I'm doing.
Oh, that's great. Well, let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it you're researching and writing about?
Sure. So my dissertation is essentially an institutional history of an educational organization called Junior Achievement that was founded in 1916 by some prominent businessmen, primarily Theodore Vail of AT&T fame. And it sort of traces the role of business through this organization in lower education from its founding in 1916 to approximately 1998. The organization still functions and operates. It has a very large enrollment worldwide, which maybe I'll get to later. Um, but yeah, it's about the role of business and how they worked to establish educational programs for students in order to create the social foundations for free enterprise.
Mm-hmm. And are you looking at the from the early 20th century to the present, or what is your sort of temporal scope for the study?
Yeah, so the temporal scope is essentially 1916 to 1998 or so, and I could talk a little bit later about why I delimited the work in that way. Um, as I continued to research, the project kept getting longer and longer and longer. And the Junior Achievement Archives, which are not held at Hagley, have records up to 2016. So it really could be a history that goes essentially to the present. But I decided to cut it off in 1998 because I think it captures the story that I'm trying to tell in that moment.
Mhm. Well, what is junior achievement and where did it come from?
Yeah, so Junior Achievement begins as an extracurricular educational organization. So it functions independently outside of schools, uh, and it begins as just an idea at the first Eastern States Agricultural Exposition in Springfield, Massachusetts. So many industrialists, especially those working in agriculture, get together and they're trying to think about what can we do to try and remedy this exodus that's happening from rural America to urban America.
Mhm.
And how are we going to prepare future workers for this new uh, economic hierarchy with the emergence of middle management and shifts away from a sort of purely industrial economy? And so three major players get together at this exposition. Theodore Vail, as I mentioned earlier, he was twice the CEO of AT&T at different moments, as well as Horace Moses, who is the founder and CEO of Strathmore Paper Company, as well as Winthrop Murray Crane, who served as both governor and later a senator for Massachusetts,
Hmm.
who hails from a family, the Crane Paper Company, who has long had the contract to print American money. So it's these three men sort of get together and they come up with this idea uh, to try and revise the prevailing vocational education
Hmm.
that had sort of come to bear in the early 20th century. So they're not so interested in this seemingly very practical type of vocational education where students are trained for specific types of industrial work. Instead, they're interested in sort of like the values of work and
Hmm.
conceptions of work and
Hmm.
ideas about work. And really what they're interested in is introducing students to this new corporate hierarchy.
Hmm. And developing a pedagogy for instructing students in how to navigate this emerging world. Is that their thrust?
Yeah, so they borrow progressive pedagogy in the form of learning by doing. And so the whole concept is that students will actually create their own miniature companies.
Oh.
Uh, they will produce actual products. They will market those products and they will sell those products. And so the whole point is for them to engage with sort of every aspect of enterprise. And initially, this is for very young students, elementary age students. And after about 10 years, it takes them quite a while. After 10 years, they realize maybe 8 to 12-year-olds aren't that interested in and so they shift their focus to high school students and to post high school about the age of 21. And they eventually settle on high school, 14 to 18 or so, as the sort of core audience for this
Hmm.
program.
So, how do they partner with schools? How do they get this curriculum in front of students?
So initially, they don't. It is a voluntary organization. Parents have to enroll their
Mhm.
children in this. It operates mostly out of churches. They're in partnership with places like the YMCA, Rotary clubs. So it's operating out of sort of these communal institutions that are not schools. That's sort of part of the major thrust of the early moment of junior achievement is that this is an anti-statist organization. They're not interested in public funding for public education. What they want to do is sort of develop an alternative to that with private funds for private ends.
Well, where does it go once this program is launched back in the 19 teens? What's sort of the narrative that you're building?
Sure. So it sort of takes various forms over time. So this early period is when Theodore Vail is sort of running the show. He dies very early. He actually dies in, I believe, 1921. And the organization is only in operation since 1919. So it's first uh, concocted as an idea in 1916, actually becomes functional in 1919, and it gets its name, Junior Achievement, in 1921. It was previously called the Boys and Girls Bureau.
Hmm.
And so under Vale, Vale's really concerned about what he perceives as sort of a loss of a Protestant work ethic. He thinks modern children don't want to work hard and they don't want to work for anything. And so he's trying to sort of reinstill this almost religious conception of the value of work. And Horace Moses takes over after Vale's death, and he keeps that in motion until the Great Depression. And once the Great Depression hits, the organization is really struggling. It seems that maybe Vale's diagnosis of the problem has become obsolete. They're lacking in funding. And so they commission a study about what they should do. And essentially, this study comes out in 1928. And in 1929, 1930 is when they really start to pivot towards this emphasis on free enterprise, protecting American capitalism from threats of communism. And they really become part of what has canonically become sort of like the birth of the modern conservatism. And so that's how it sort of shakes out during the New Deal. And this is where Hagley comes in.
Okay.
Um, so in 1937, they host a banquet in New York City at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Um, and they invite Charles Hook to come be the keynote speaker. And at the time, Charles Hook is not only the CEO of Armco Steel, he is also the president of the National Association of Manufacturers. And so this is really the first moment in which junior achievement finds itself in conversation with big business. So
Mhm.
it had been run by folks who were in big business, but this is the first time where it really finds itself in partnership with an organization committed to promoting free enterprise and lobbying on behalf of big business. So that's really where it all begins. So my trip to Hagley, I engaged with the National Association of Manufacturers Archives. Um, and you can really get lost in those archives. And luckily for us, Jennifer Delton wrote that wonderful book, The Industrialists. Um, but you can really get drawn in and be like, wow, there's really a story to tell here. And I think there still is a story to tell. It's not the story that I'm telling. Um, but there is just a plethora of information about the educational programs developed by the National Association of Manufacturers in this post-New Deal period, really in the post-war period. All sorts of engagement with religious groups, with women's organizations, and Jennifer Delton covers those to some extent. But I think there could be an entire book about the role of NAM in educational ventures, especially in lower education, rather than perhaps worker training programs. Um, so Charles Hook seems to find value in this project. And just a few years after he gives this keynote speech in the late 1930s, he actually becomes the president of Junior Achievement.
Mm.
So there's this through line from NAM to JA that happens in the 40s, and he runs Junior Achievement until his death in the early 1960s. So it really becomes part and parcel of what NAM is trying to do on its own, but aimed at students.
Mhm. And the ideological project being um, to really convince public opinion that free enterprise, as the phrase went, was the ideal system.
Both, I think it's an ideological project
Hmm.
to garner support for conceptions of free enterprise, but also it is practical insofar as they need people who are familiar with this new economic hierarchy, this new corporate hierarchy. They need middle managers. And so by introducing students to these structures at an early age, the hope is that they will go on to be able to fill those roles. And these programs really do reflect corporate hierarchies. Students are elected to positions like president and treasurer and secretary. They really take on real organizational roles within these miniature companies. Um, and the goal is that they might be able to be the next generation of middle management that corporate America so badly needs at the time.
Yeah, I see. So that really does bring in pedagogy as the appropriate frame, insofar as it's both teaching values, but also, in a sense, more practical knowledge.
Yeah, and part of I think this is reflective of my training as a historian of education, primarily. Both of my advisors are sort of historians of education in a very traditional sense. I also work with a friend of Hagley, Paige Glotzer, who is not a historian of education. So I'm trying to, as part of this project, in my mind, repatriate the story of junior achievement within the history of education,
Hmm.
but also to make the history of education more attentive to broader economic concerns. And it's not to say that historians of education don't attend to political economy, but I think they tend to do it in somewhat of a narrow sense. And the history of education has waxed and waned, but it has become once again sort of focused on schools as institutions. Um, and I'm trying to maybe move beyond that with the story of junior achievement to say there are other places where education happens,
Mm.
and those are equally as important as schools themselves.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point, and I see how your project really builds upon that. Did junior achievement remain outside of schools, or is there a point at which they um, well saw the writing on the wall and needed to go where the kids were?
Yeah, so they do acquiesce to public education. in the 1970s. So it takes them quite a while. But in the 1970s, they start to develop programs to operate in schools. And this is a practical move because their signature program, the Junior Achievement Company, this mini company program, um, is not especially economically viable. So they need to have funding for locations. Like, what is the infrastructure in which this will take place? They need to have uh, lots of volunteers on board to oversee this program. So typically, this took shape with local businessmen would sort of volunteer to direct students. But all of these things are complicated and they take time and they take money. And so what they recognize in the 70s, and Carolyn Jack, her dissertation, has a wonderful section on these programs that develop in the 70s and 80s. They start to develop programs that will function in schools so that they can take advantage of public funding for school buildings. They can take advantage of oversight in the form of teachers who are on public salaries. And they also actually become extractive in a sense in that they're selling this curriculum to schools.
Mm.
So not only are they able to defray the costs of the miniature company operations, they're actually able to turn a profit by selling pedagogical materials and a bit later in the late 80s, proprietary computer software
Mm.
um, that students interact with. So they do find themselves in schools in the 70s. It starts as something called Project Business. And essentially, what they do is they develop programs that would replace a standard social studies that introduce students to, or at the time, orthodox economic ideas. So, like a post-Keynesian conception of capitalism. Um, so that's their first foray into public education.
When you say post-Keynesian, do we have the sort of Chicago School of economics ideas percolating through this program, or what is their what's their the flavor of the week, so to speak?
Yes, exactly, exactly. Something that's more in favor of free markets, uh, that works against government intervention. And this is when we really get the shift in junior achievement to uh, promoting entrepreneurialism. So they're interested
Mm.
in sort of creating entrepreneurs through these programs like applied economics. The idea is not so much that students are necessarily just familiar with how the economy, so to speak, functions, but that they might be enticed to participate in it in a way that sort of builds a new type of capitalism through entrepreneurialism. So that's one of the major shifts that occurs. Not only do they now find themselves operating within public education, but they're emphasizing entrepreneurialism as opposed to Vail's conception, which was not entrepreneurial. It was about sort of a work ethic, a type of way of understanding where you belong within this hierarchy. And that was perhaps in the middle. But that shifts to saying, no, you can do this too. You can be at the top of this hierarchy.
Mhm.
Um, so that is one of the major domestic shifts in junior achievement in the 70s and 80s.
Mhm. Let's bring it all the way to 1998, toward the end of your narrative. What is going on then?
Yeah, so in the late 80s, there's another shift. So in the 70s and 80s, it's what I would maybe characterize as a tacit acceptance of public funding. They're not
Mhm.
directly taking public monies per se, but they're utilizing public infrastructure to run this program, although they are selling the curriculum to schools. So there is a transfer of public funds to private organizations. But in the late 80s, they ramp up their global expansion
Hmm.
uh, in the former Soviet bloc. So
Hmm.
they're taking this international, and it had already had an international movement. They tried and failed in Latin America in the 60s, but they're rather successful in expanding in the late 80s, early 90s, through the 2000s in Eastern Europe and in Asia. And they do that with USAID money. So
Hmm.
they really, for the first time, start to take federal funds to expand this abroad and really to sell a vision of American free enterprise to former Soviet, the former Soviet bloc. So that's really how international expansion begins. And that's why I decided to end the narrative in 1998. By 1998, you have at least six or eight former Soviet states where junior achievement is operating. And I thought that captured enough of the story, and it didn't necessarily need to go into the 2000s.
Hmm.
Um, so that's another interesting piece of this story is sort of the role of the global economy, uh, globalization, and a sort of an exporting of an American ideal to these former communist states.
Hmm. Yeah, that is a fascinating turn. Did they alter the materials at all, or was it substantively the same program that they've just simply exported to other places?
So it operated very similarly and significantly operated in a similar fashion where it's sort of an outside of school program, an optional program to operate in communities. Um, yeah, so they're really ex what they're exporting, I think, is an idea here more than a specific program. It's sort of about getting boots on the ground, articulating these ideas
Hmm.
in this new environment, in an environment that they think is has a lot of potential for economic development.
Hmm. And sort of proselytization of this value system.
Exactly. And so it sort of comes full circle in that way, right? It has these religious roots and it almost becomes a religion in and of itself
Yeah.
by the time they're exporting these ideas. Yeah, so the project would not be able to be complete without Hagley. I just wanted to jump back to the collections
Yeah,
quick.
sure, please do.
Um, so the NAM archives, like I said, you can really get lost in there on things that aren't about your project. But some of the most helpful things were because Charles Hook was the president, there's lots of great biographical information on him there that I was able to find that the Junior Achievement Archives do not necessarily have. Um, the speech that he gave at that banquet is held at the Hagley Junior Achievement Archive, also does not have a copy of that.
Mm.
Um, and I also found lots of speeches from Charles Hook as his time as NAM president that are very anti-labor. He
Mm.
was really going on a circuit giving these anti-union, anti-labor speeches, which I think reflects how JA ultimately develops under his tenure as president. So those things were really important. Um, and I also looked at the John Raskob papers, um, because he was invited to this breakfast that takes place uh, in 1941. It's really one of the first things that Hook does as president. And he holds this breakfast at the Waldorf Astoria. And there's some correspondence. Charles Hook is writing directly to Raskob, and he's saying, "Hey, will you come to this? There's all these other important folks coming." The opening line of the letter is like, "Will you join me and Bayard Colgate at this breakfast?" And Raskob actually isn't able to attend, but for whatever reason, in his archival collection is a menu from this breakfast, which is just fantastic. Getting to see what was on the menu and what they were eating, and then mostly it's just a list of people in attendance and their corporate affiliations. Um, but perhaps the best thing that I found in the archive is actually a pamphlet that was developed after this breakfast, And so the timing is quite remarkable. So the breakfast takes place on December 5th, 1941.
Uh-huh.
So 2 days later, everything sort of changes. And so they circulate this pamphlet in uh, the next month or so, or maybe even, yeah, late or early January 1941. That's titled 700 Came to Breakfast. And it has this wonderful sort of black and white drawing of a banquet table. And it goes on to say, they listened to 700 leaders of American business in this breakfast. And it really emphasizes how important uh, this educational venture is going to be for enterprise. So there's a bunch of great speakers. Charles Hook speaks. Roy Moore speaks, who's the president of Canada Dry Ginger Ale. And Bayard Colgate also speaks, who is at the time the chairman of Colgate Palmolive. And the best part is the very last page of this pamphlet. It's only a 3-page pamphlet, is a photograph of a bunch of checks that were written out to junior achievement by various corporations. And what this is really it's a funding pamphlet saying, "Will you be the next contributor?" They say, "These folks, quote, heard the call to defend the free enterprise system, and they answered," on a picture of all these different checks that were written to junior achievement. So that
Wow.
was fantastic. The JA archive has that as well, but it was just seeing it in the Raskeb papers alongside correspondence between
Hmm.
Raskeb and Hook was fantastic. So yeah, the project would not be possible without Hagley, or at least it certainly wouldn't have the texture that
Mm.
it really needs, I think, to drive home. And I'm still, I'm in the very early stages of the project, so I'll be returning to Hagley at some point. Um, but yeah, there was just some really fabulous things that I was able to find there.
Hmm. Sounds like it.
Yeah, yep.
Well, Maxwell, thank you so much for taking the time to share your work with us. It's been really interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Hagley for having these collections open to scholars to take a look at. And I'm not sure if it gets mentioned. It wasn't mentioned to me before I came to Hagley. Angus MacLeod told me about it. It is a beautiful, beautiful property. It is a real pleasure to be there and to do research there. And archival research can be lonely and it can be isolating, uh, but it's made all the better being on the Hagley grounds.
Well, thank you so much for saying so. I hope to see you back another time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Gregory.
Mhm. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.